Welcome back. You're looking to really get a handle on big ideas, but maybe without spending, weeks buried in books.
That's definitely the goal here.
Good. So today, we're jumping into something huge. Foundational, really. The agricultural revolution.
A hoax.
Exactly, a hoax. I mean, that title alone,
hmm
it definitely made me stop and think. It questions everything you sort of assume, right?
It's designed to do that, I think. And the core idea is pretty challenging, that this massive shift wasn't the clear step forward we often imagine.
Not a clear step forward.
Maybe more of a sideways step. Or, as the source suggests, maybe even a step back in some really important ways for, the average person.
A step backwards. Okay, my interest is piqued. So we're talking about that huge change, hunter-gatherers becoming farmers. What's the source asking us to reconsider here?
Well, it looks at a whole range of things. How farming actually felt for the people doing it, their health, their daily lives.
Right.
And then the bigger picture. How it changed our societies, our relationship with nature, with animals. And this really interesting question about whether it was our, brilliant intelligence that drove it all, or maybe something else.
Something else, like
Like luck, maybe, or geography. And then there's this wild idea. Did we domesticate wheat? Or did we, in a way, domesticate us?
Whoa, okay. Wheat domesticating us. That sounds like something we need to unpack.
Definitely.
All right. So our mission for this deep dive. Let's really dig into these arguments, pull out the key insights, the surprising stuff from this source. Let's start with that idea. You mentioned agriculture as a trap. What was the promise versus the reality?
Well, the perceived promise, you'd imagine, was stability, predictability, food security,
Right.
not having to constantly roam, searching for the next meal. Sounds pretty good, right?
Yeah, sounds like a definite upgrade. Settle down, relax a bit, maybe.
That's the logical assumption. But the source argues this stability, or perceived stability, came at a really steep price. Basically, a much, much harder life for those first farmers day to day.
Harder. How so? I mean, farming sounds tiring, but harder than constantly hunting and gathering.
Think about the type of work. Hunter-gatherers worked, sure, but their activities were often more varied. Farming, though, the source paints a picture of relentless, back-breaking labor.
Like what specifically?
Clearing fields, breaking ground, planting, endless watering, weeding, fighting off pests. It wasn't just seasonal work, it was this constant, demanding cycle, dawn till dusk, a lot of the time.
Wow, okay, so the dream of, kicking back with a full-grain silo didn't quite match up.
Not for the average person, the source suggests. It was more toil, less leisure, a fundamental trade-off that we often overlook.
So more work. But did they at least get better food out of it, more nutritious?
That's another contested point. Quantity, yes, probably more calories per acre overall. But quality, maybe not.
How so?
Hunter-gatherer diets were incredibly diverse. All sorts of plants, nuts, fruits, animals. Farmers, especially early on, tended to rely very heavily on just one or two staple crops. Think wheat, or rice, or corn.
Right, the big ones.
Yeah. And while those provide calories, relying so heavily on them could actually lead to nutritional deficiencies. Missing out on vitamins and minerals you'd get from a more varied diet.
So potentially more food overall, but maybe less healthy food.
It's a definite possibility raised by the source. More mouths could be fed, but perhaps not always fed as well.
And you mentioned population growth earlier. That sounds like a success story, but the source sees a downside.
It does. More food allows for more people, obviously, population booms. But concentrating all those people in villages and early towns, well, that creates ideal conditions for diseases to spread.
Okay. Sanitation probably wasn't great.
Exactly. And being so reliant on those few crops made entire populations incredibly vulnerable. If the wheat harvest failed, catastrophe, famine, much more widespread than a localized shortage might have been for hunter-gatherers.
Right, putting all your eggs in one basket, agriculturally speaking. And this links to conflict and inequality, too. How did farming sow those seeds?
Well, once you're settled, you have things worth defending. Land, primarily. Stored grain, livestock. Hunter-gatherers might have had territorial disputes, but farmers had fixed property.
Something concrete to fight over.
Precisely. And the potential for surplus food, some people producing more than they needed, allowed others to not farm, to become specialists. Potters, priests, soldiers, and eventually rulers.
The beginnings of hierarchy.
Yes. Those who controlled the surplus, especially land and grain, gained power. So you see the emergence of social classes, inequality, things much less pronounced in most hunter-gatherer bands.
Okay, so this revolution is looking less like a simple improvement and more like a complex trade-off with some serious downsides. Now, what about this intelligence versus luck angle? Was farming just the inevitable result of humans getting smarter?
The source really pushes back against that simple narrative. The idea that we cleverly figured out farming everywhere because we reached a certain stage of intelligence.
Yeah, that's kind of the standard story.
But the source points out that agriculture only arose independently in a very few specific places on Earth.
Where?
Primarily the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, parts of China, and areas in Central America, maybe a couple of others, but not everywhere.
So why there and not, say, Australia or Southern Africa? Were the people there just
smarter?
The source argues no, not necessarily. What those specific regions had was, well, luck. Geographical luck. They happened to be home to wild plants and animals that were suitable for domestication.
Suitable how?
Plants like wild wheat and barley, animals like wild sheep, goats, cattle, pigs. Species that had the right characteristics, biologically and behaviorally, to be farmed or herded relatively easily.
Whereas other places just didn't have that raw material. Exactly. Many regions had plenty of plants and animals, but none that lent themselves easily to agriculture. So people there continued successfully as hunter-gatherers for thousands more years. Not because they were less intelligent, but because they didn't have the same biological toolkit to work with.
That really changes the perspective. It wasn't just human ingenuity, but the right ingredients being in the right place at the right time.
That's a major argument in the source. It decenters human genius a bit and brings environment and biology back into the picture.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's get to that really provocative idea. The domestication paradox. Wheat domesticating us. Explain that one.
Right, this flips the whole concept on its head. We usually think we were the agents, we took control of wheat.
Yeah, we chose it, we planted it, we improved it.
But the source says, try looking at it from the wheat's point of view, an evolutionary perspective. 10,000 years ago, wheat was just an insignificant wild grass in a small part of the Middle East. Today, it covers millions and millions of square kilometers across the globe, far more territory than it ever occupied naturally. From wheat's perspective, teaming up with humans was an incredibly successful evolutionary strategy.
Wow, okay, I see where this is going. So how did wheat pull off this global conquest?
By getting humans to do all the hard work for it. Humans cleared forests and removed rocks that wheat couldn't handle. We broke up the soil. We dug irrigation ditches to bring it water. We spent countless hours weeding out its competitors. We protected it from pests and diseases.
We basically became its servants.
In a very real sense, yes. The source argues that wheat manipulated Homo sapiens to serve its needs. We spread it across the world, dedicated vast amounts of energy to its care and protection, all because we became dependent on it for food.
So we thought we were mastering nature, but maybe one particular grass was mastering us.
That's the paradox. It forces you to question who was really in charge, who benefited most in evolutionary terms. Wheat's success is undeniable, measured by its sheer proliferation.
That is a genuinely mind-bending way to look at it. A field of wheat suddenly looks cunning.
Doesn't it?
Okay, let's talk about the physical side, the bodily impact. How did this new farming lifestyle affect our actual bodies?
Well, our bodies, evolved over millions of years for a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Lots of walking, running, climbing, occasional bursts of intense activity, varied movements.
Right, agility was key.
Exactly. Then suddenly, agriculture demands very different things. Hours spent bending over, repetitive motions like digging or grinding grain, lifting heavy loads. These put new kinds of stress on our skeletons and muscles.
Things we weren't really built for.
Arguably not optimally, no. The source suggests this mismatch contributed to things like back problems, arthritis, and other skeletal issues we see evidence of in early farming populations. It raises the question, who was really being tamed here? Were we domesticating wheat, or was the physical drudgery of farming domesticating us?
Ouch. Literally. So if farming was so hard on the body, potentially less nutritious, and involved more work, why stick with it? This brings us to evolutionary success versus individual well-being.
This is the crucial evolutionary logic, according to the source. Even if the individual farmer had a tougher, maybe shorter, less healthy life than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, agriculture allowed you to produce significantly more food from a given patch of land, more calories per hectare.
Okay, so sheer quantity.
Yes. And that quantity could support a much larger population, more babies surviving, villages growing into towns. From evolution's perspective, which is all about survival and reproduction of the species, that's success.
So evolution doesn't care if you're happy or comfortable, just if there are more of you.
Pretty much. The source frames it as a harsh truth. Agriculture was good for the species Homo sapiens in terms of numbers, but potentially bad for the individual Homo sapiens in terms of quality of life. A classic evolutionary trade-off.
More of us, but maybe each of us having a harder time. Wow. Okay, what about freedom and complexity? The source mentions a loss of freedom.
Yeah, life arguably became much more complex and, in some ways, less free. Hunter-gatherers had mobility. If resources dwindled or conflict arose, they could often just move.
Right, pack up and go.
Farmers couldn't do that easily. They were tied to their land, their crops, their stored food, their permanent settlements. Their diet became narrower, focused on those staples. They lost the flexibility and adaptability that came with a nomadic life.
Trapped by their own success, in a way.
You could say that. And once populations grew and societies became dependent on agriculture, going back wasn't really an option. The system became self-perpetuating, locking people into this new, more complex, and perhaps more constrained way of life.
Locked in. And it wasn't just humans who were affected, right? The impact on animals was profound.
Absolutely profound. For species like sheep, goats, cows, pigs, chickens, the agricultural revolution marked a complete transformation of their existence. From wild, free-roaming animals to, essentially, property.
Property.
Yes. Humans began controlling their breeding, selecting for traits we found useful: more wool, more milk, faster growth, docility. It was the start of selective breeding as we know it.
And like with wheat, their numbers exploded, didn't they? So evolutionary success for them, too.
In terms of sheer numbers, yes. There are vastly more chickens and cows on Earth today than their wild ancestors ever numbered. But the source draws a sharp contrast between this numerical success and the quality of life for the individual animal.
How so?
Wild animals live according to their own instincts and life cycles. Domesticated animals, particularly under intensive farming conditions, often live short, constrained, unnatural lives dictated entirely by human needs.
The source gives examples of lifespan differences.
It does. Think about wild jungle fowl, the ancestor of chickens. They can live for several years. Broiler chickens raised for meat, often slaughtered at just 6 or 7 weeks old. Wild cattle can live 20 years or more. A modern dairy cow, often considered spent and sent to slaughter after maybe 5 years because her milk production drops. Their evolutionary success as a species came at the cost of often miserable lives for countless individuals.
That's a really stark contrast. And the source mentions methods used to control them.
It alludes to practices designed purely for human convenience and control, sometimes involving mutilation or extreme confinement to prevent escape or manage behavior. It really paints the agricultural revolution as a potential catastrophe, not just for many humans, but for billions of animals too. Another layer to this trap.
It really expands the definition of who was impacted. Okay, let's shift to human interactions. Settling down changed how we related to each other and the land.
Massively. Hunter-gatherers often had a relationship with the territory, but the concept of owning land in the way a farmer does was different. Farming fostered deep emotional ties to a specific plot of ground. It became mine.
The birth of private property in a new sense.
Exactly. Mine and yours. And with that came the need for boundaries, fences, defenses. We started dividing the world up in a way hunter-gatherers likely didn't conceive of.
And our relationship with the environment overall.
Hunter-gatherers lived within their environment, adapting to it. Farmers began actively remaking their environment to suit their needs.
Wow.
Clearing forests for fields, diverting rivers for irrigation, building permanent villages, and eventually cities. They created artificial landscapes tailored for agriculture.
So less adapting to nature, more trying to control it.
Right. The source highlights this paradox. The human population grew enormously, but we increasingly lived within these human-altered, arguably artificial bubbles, perhaps becoming more disconnected from the wider natural world.
More numerous, but more confined.
Interesting. What about wealth? Farmers seem richer, but the source calls it a burden.
Well, compared to a hunter-gatherer band who might carry all their possessions, a farming family with a house, tools, stored grain, and livestock would certainly look richer. They had more stuff.
But that came with strings attached. Definitely. More stuff means more to worry about, more to protect. You become tied down by your possessions. And as we discuss, this accumulation of wealth, especially land and surplus food, was a key driver in the development of social hierarchies.
Right, the haves and have-nots.
Exactly. Those who controlled the resources gained power. So the source argues These physical settlements and accumulations of property went hand in hand with the creation of psychological and social boundaries. A shift from relative freedom and equality towards dependence and ingrained social inequality.
The seeds of inequality sown right alongside the wheat and barley. Okay, another shift. The dawn of planning and anxiety. How did farming change our relationship with time?
Hunter-gatherers largely lived in the present. Their main concerns were immediate, finding food for today, maybe tomorrow. Farmers, by necessity, had to become future-oriented.
How so?
You have to plan months ahead for planting seasons. You have to worry about unpredictable weather, potential droughts or floods, pests that could wipe out your future harvest. You have to save seeds, store food for the winter or lean times.
So a constant focus on what might happen.
Yes. And the source suggests this constant need to plan for the future, to mitigate risks, introduced a new kind of baseline anxiety into human existence. The irony is that the quest for future security may have actually led to more present worry.
Worrying about harvests instead of the immediate hunt, and this effort, this planning. Did everyone benefit equally from it?
Almost certainly not. The agricultural surplus, the extra food produced by the labor of the many, is what allowed for the rise of elites. Kings, priests, bureaucrats, soldiers.
People who didn't have to farm themselves.
Right. They could engage in politics, art, philosophy, warfare, activities funded essentially by the hard labor of peasant farmers. The source makes the point that many of the grand monuments of antiquity, the pyramids, the temples, they were built on the foundation of that agricultural surplus, often by laborers who saw little direct benefit themselves.
A stark division of labor and reward. This sounds like it required new ways to organize people, managing mass societies, and the power of myths. How did agriculture lead to this?
Well, once you have thousands, or eventually millions, of people living together in settled societies, the old hunter-gatherer ways of cooperating based on kinship and direct relationships just don't scale up. You can't personally know everyone in a city.
Right. So how do you get strangers to cooperate?
The source argues that the key was the development of shared beliefs, shared stories, what it terms imagined orders. These are things that don't exist objectively in nature, but that large numbers of people believe in collectively.
Like what? Give me an example.
Think about gods, nations, laws, human rights, or even money. None of these are tangible physical objects. They exist because we collectively agree they exist and have value or authority. That shared belief allows millions of strangers to trust each other, follow the same rules, and cooperate on vast projects.
So myths, in this sense, aren't necessarily lies, but shared fictions that enable cooperation.
Exactly. Fictions that become socially real because we all buy into them. Early versions might have been beliefs in ancestor spirits or tribal totems, but these evolved into the complex, religious, political, and economic narratives that underpin civilizations.
But how do you keep everyone believing? How do you maintain these imagined orders? They seem fragile.
They can be, but societies develop powerful ways to sustain them. The source highlights 3 key strategies.
Okay, what are they?
First, you never, ever admit that the order is just imagined. You present it as natural, inevitable, divinely ordained. It's always been this way, or this is God's will, or this is just natural law.
Make it seem unquestionable.
Right. Second, you embed the imagined order into the physical world. Think about architecture palaces, project power. Churches project divine authority. Individual houses reinforce ideas of private property. Laws are written down, borders are drawn on maps. The fiction takes tangible form.
Making the abstract feel concrete.
Precisely. And third, and maybe most subtly, you shape people's desires to align with the imagined order. Think about modern consumerism. It doesn't just sell products, it sells a vision of happiness achieved through buying things, which perfectly supports the capitalist economic order. Romantic myths encourage people to buy things for love, further fueling consumption.
Wow. So it's not just laws enforced, but shaping how we think and what we want.
That's the argument. Belief is often more powerful than coercion in the long run. If people genuinely believe in the system, it becomes incredibly stable.
Okay, but managing all this, the laws, the property, the taxes from agriculture, that requires keeping track of a lot of information, right? More than one person could remember.
Absolutely. And that leads directly to the next major point. The limits of the brain and the invention of writing. Human memory, while impressive, just isn't built to store the sheer volume of data needed to run a complex agricultural state.
Unlike ants or bees, who have their social rules kind of hardwired.
Exactly. We needed an external storage system. And around 3500 to 3000 BCE, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia came up with a solution. Writing.
The birth of writing. But the source says its initial purpose wasn't poetry or storytelling.
No, not at all. The earliest forms of writing were almost entirely practical, primarily used for accounting and record keeping.
Like counting grain sacks.
Pretty much. The first known written texts are often things like lists of goods, tax records, receipts, calculations of debt. It was invented to manage the increasingly complex economic and administrative burden of agricultural societies.
So bureaucracy drove the invention of writing.
Largely, yes. This early Sumerian script was what the source calls a partial script. It wasn't designed to represent the full richness of spoken language, but rather to record specific types of data quantities, names, items.
Different from, say, later Egyptian hieroglyphs or our alphabet.
Yes, those are full scripts, capable of expressing almost anything that can be said. Early Sumerian writing was more like a specialized notation system for administration, though other systems existed too, like the Inca's quipu, using knotted strings to record complex data without a phonetic script.
Fascinating. So writing starts with numbers, not narratives. But it obviously grew beyond that.
It did. Over centuries and millennia, writing systems evolved. Full scripts developed, and writing expanded its role dramatically, recording laws, religious texts, history, literature, personal messages. But this created a new problem.
What's that?
Information overload. How do you organize, store, and retrieve all this written knowledge? This led to the development of archives, libraries, schools for scribes, and sophisticated bureaucracies in places like Sumer, Egypt, China, and the Inca Empire. Writing didn't just record society, it fundamentally reshaped how society was organized.
And maybe even how we think.
The source suggests so. Learning to read and write, working with lists and tables and abstract symbols, likely encouraged more analytical, systematic, bureaucratic ways of thinking, a cognitive shift alongside the societal one.
From remembering stories to processing data, which brings us right up to the modern day,
Yeah.
the age of data.
Absolutely. We've gone from inventing systems to manage data to becoming utterly dependent on data processing to understand almost every aspect of our world.
How so?
Think about governance, economics, science, even our social lives. Everything is increasingly mediated through statistics, databases, algorithms. Making sense of complex systems, from climate change to global finance, requires processing vast amounts of quantitative information.
More than our brains can handle intuitively.
Far more, which is why computers and data science have become so central. They can handle the scale and complexity in ways the unaided human mind simply cannot.
But the source ends this section with a lingering question, right?
Yes, a provocative one. As we rely more and more on these complex data systems we've created, who is actually in control? Is it still us? Or are we increasingly guided, perhaps even constrained, by the logic of the data and the algorithms?
Are the tools becoming the masters? Another unsettling thought, echoing that wheat paradox.
It definitely echoes it.
Okay, let's circle back to social structures. This source talks about the myth of justice in history. What's the core argument there?
The argument is that the hierarchies we see throughout history, class divisions, racial discrimination, gender inequality, are not based on objective biological realities or immutable natural laws. They are essentially products of those imagined orders we talked about.
Human-made rules and beliefs.
Yes. Rules and beliefs that benefit some groups over others, which are then justified using various narratives, often claiming they are natural or divinely ordained. The source points to blatant contradictions, like the U.S. Declaration of Independence proclaiming equality while upholding slavery, or ancient codes like Hammurabi's explicitly stating that different social classes had different rights, supposedly decreed by the gods.
So justice and equality are often ideals, but the reality created by these imagined orders is usually hierarchy.
That's the claim. Even supposedly scientific justifications for inequality, like theories of racial superiority, have been used historically to prop up these human-made hierarchies, despite later being debunked. These systems aren't natural. They are constructed and fiercely defended.
And they seem incredibly persistent. Why is that? The source talks about the functional and self-perpetuating nature of hierarchy.
Part of it might be perceived efficiency. Organizing large numbers of people is complex, and hierarchies offer a seemingly straightforward way to assign roles and maintain order, even if it's unjust.
Easier to manage, maybe.
Perhaps. But more importantly, once a hierarchy is established, it tends to reinforce itself. Those at the top have the power and resources to maintain the system that benefits them. They control the laws, the narrative, often the means of violence, and those lower down often lack the resources or organization to challenge it effectively. The system creates conditions that make it hard to escape.
So it's not necessarily that people like the hierarchy, but it becomes entrenched.
Very much so. And we see this pattern across history: feudalism, caste systems, racial segregation, economic inequality in capitalist societies. The specific justifications change, but the tendency for power to consolidate and perpetuate itself remains.
Does change ever happen then? Can these systems be broken?
Yes, but the source emphasizes that significant social change through pressure is usually required. Meaning that fundamental shifts towards greater equality rarely happen because those in power have a sudden change of heart. History suggests it almost always requires sustained pressure, protest, and struggle from those who are disadvantaged by the system. Think of the French Revolution, the abolitionist movement, the fight for suffrage, the civil rights movement, the end of apartheid in South Africa. These changes didn't come easily. They were forced by mass movements challenging the existing order. Change typically comes from below, not as a gift from above.
That's a crucial point. Now, these hierarchies aren't all the same, are they? The source mentions variations.
Right. While the principle of hierarchy might be common, the basis for that hierarchy varies enormously across cultures and time periods.
Like what?
In traditional India, it was the caste system, supposedly based on birth and religious purity. In the post-slavery United States, race became the primary dividing line. In the Ottoman Empire, religion played a key role in determining status and rights. Different societies invent different justifications.
But the underlying dynamic is similar.
Often, yes. Those who find themselves at the top of whatever system exists tend to work to maintain their position and the beliefs that justify it.
Let's look at those case studies. India's caste system and U.S. racial hierarchy. What do they illustrate?
The Indian caste system shows how a hierarchy, possibly originating with the arrival of Indo-Aryan groups thousands of years ago, can become deeply embedded through religious beliefs and social practices, lasting for millennia and defining almost every aspect of life.
And race in America.
That case illustrates how even after a legal change, the abolition of slavery, a powerful hierarchy can persist through other means: Jim Crow laws, systemic discrimination in housing, employment, education. These created a cycle where racial minorities were denied opportunities, which then reinforced existing prejudices and disadvantages.
A self-fulfilling prophecy of inequality.
Exactly. The source points out how these disadvantages were often wrongly attributed to inherent biological inferiority. A claim disproven as opportunities, particularly in education, became slightly more accessible, showing it was the system, not biology, creating the disparities. The cycle of stigma and oppression is hard to break.
A powerful example of how constructed hierarchies perpetuate themselves. What about the final case? The enduring gender hierarchy.
This one is particularly striking because, as the source notes, the subordination of women has been remarkably widespread across vastly different cultures throughout history. It's almost a historical universal, though the specific forms vary.
How is this expressed historically?
Often through legal systems where women were considered property first of their fathers, then of their husbands. The source mentions how early rape laws were often framed as property crimes against the woman's male owner, not crimes against her bodily autonomy.
That's shocking to think about now.
It is. And the source notes that even legal recognition of things like marital rape is surprisingly recent in many places. Beyond law, deeply ingrained social norms dictated different roles, behaviors, and opportunities for men and women.
But the source argues these aren't natural.
Precisely. Because these roles and expectations do vary across cultures and have changed significantly over time, especially in recent decades due to social movements and policy changes. If gender roles were purely dictated by biology or natural law, they shouldn't be so malleable. Their variability demonstrates their socially constructed nature.
So, like race and caste, it's another powerful imagined order that has shaped societies profoundly.
Yes. Perhaps the oldest and most persistent one.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground, really rethinking the agricultural revolution based on this source. How should we sum up its overall message?
I think the core message is that the agricultural revolution, while undeniably a pivotal turning point that enabled population growth and the rise of civilizations, was far from an unalloyed good. It was a complex transition with profound and often negative consequences for individual well-being, social equality, animal welfare, and our relationship with the planet.
It set the stage for the modern world, but also baked in many of the problems we still grapple with.
That's a good way to put it. It created the foundations for states, writing, complex economies, but also for widespread social hierarchy, property disputes, new forms of labor, and arguably new anxieties. It wasn't just about food, it reshaped humanity and the planet.
So what are the absolute key takeaways you think we should leave listeners with from this deep dive?
Okay. First, question the simple narrative of progress. Agriculture meant harder work and potentially worse nutrition for many individuals. Second, remember the role of luck and geography. It wasn't just about human smarts. Third, that mind-bending domestication paradox. Did wheat use us? Fourth, the deep link between agriculture, settlement, property, and the rise of social inequality and hierarchy. Fifth, the power of imagined orders, shared beliefs in organizing large societies, for better or worse. And finally, the impact wasn't limited to humans. It transformed the lives of domesticated animals, often negatively.
That's a powerful set of reconsiderations. It really makes you look at the world around us, our cities, our farms, our social structures in a different light, seeing the echoes of those ancient trade-offs.
Absolutely. The patterns established back then are still incredibly relevant.
And that final provocation from the source. Thinking about the propaganda of wild grass, are we today still caught in the ripples of that ancient shift? Maybe still serving the needs of those staple crops more than our own well-being sometimes?
It's a really challenging question, isn't it? To what extent are our modern lives, our systems, our priorities still shaped by that initial bargain struck 10,000 years ago? What trade-offs are we still making, perhaps without even realizing it?
Definitely something to chew on. Thank you for walking us through these complex ideas.
My pleasure. It's fascinating material.
It certainly is. Thanks everyone for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.